Elias Tandy walked one fence line for 44 years, knew every post by the feel of the ground under his boots. And on the morning they retired him, they handed him $6 and a bus ticket and told him the farm had no more use for his legs. He didn't argue. He folded that ticket into his shirt pocket, buttoned it down, and walked out past the fence one last time. That's when he saw it. The wire had already been moved. 60 acres of the widow Merrick's creek bottom, gone in a single night of fresh stakes. Vernon Coyle's new survey swore that bottomland had always been his. And in a courtroom packed with 40 neighbors, Coyle's lawyer looked back at the old hired man in the last row and smiled. Whatever he remembers isn't a survey, Your Honor. It's a story. But Elias remembered a morning back in 1895. 2 men, a spade, and a stone they buried where the true corner stood. A stone nobody alive had thought of in 40 years, and the night before the ruling, he took up a lantern and a spade of his own and went out to find it. If you've ever been made to feel that a lifetime of your work counted for nothing, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small kindness. Subscribe so an old fence line like this one can find the folks who need it. And in the comments, tell me what town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me tell you about Elias Tandy. Cedar Bend sat in the low green fold of Harlow County, Kansas, where the creek came down off the flats and spread itself thin over the best soil in 3 townships. Spring of 1936. The dust was bad to the west of there, bad enough that men spoke of it in church. But the creek kept Cedar Bend alive. Water always finds the low ground. And the low ground was the Merrick bottom. Elias had worked that ground since 1892. He came to it a young man, hired on by Samuel Merrick's father when the old man still plowed his own furrows. He stayed on through the father, and then through Samuel, and now, with both men in the churchyard, he stayed on for Samuel's widow, Ada, 44 years. He'd buried 2 Merrick men and helped bring in 44 harvests. And there wasn't a stone or a stump or a soft spot in that whole section he couldn't find blindfolded. He'd earned that in his bones. Back in 1895, when the county sent its surveyor out to run the official section lines, they needed a chainman. A strong young fellow to drag the steel chain taut and drive the pins and dig where the corners fell. Elias was that young fellow. He walked every rod of that line with the county surveyor, a careful Swede named Lindquist, and together they set the corners of the whole section. He remembered the day they set the one down in the creek bottom. Hot, cicadas going in the cottonwoods. Lindquist saying a corner had to be set where a man could find it 100 years on, so they didn't just drive a pin. They chiseled the date into a slab of good hard limestone and buried it 3 feet down, right at the true corner, close by a big cottonwood that Lindquist blazed with his hatchet. A witness tree, he called it. Something living to stand guard over the stone. Elias had chiseled the numbers himself. 8, 9, 5. He could still feel the cold weight of that stone in his young hands. Now understand, before I tell you how they threw him away, you'd have loved this man. Everyone at Cedar Bend did. He'd taught Samuel Merrick to plow the bottom straight when Samuel was a boy no higher than the plow handles. Taught him to read the creek, to know when the water was rising and when it was just talking. And when Samuel married Ada and brought her out to Cedar Bend, Elias took to her the way an old dog takes to a kind hand. Every year, when the first tomato came ripe in the garden patch by the pump, he didn't eat it. He carried it up to the house, still warm from the sun, and set it on Ada's kitchen sill. First one of the season, every season, going back longer than either of them could rightly say. It was the kind of thing you don't notice a man doing until the day it stops. That's who Elias Tandy was. A man whose whole life was that place, whose whole worth was in his hands and his memory. Remember that. Because the men who came for the bottom didn't see any of it. It started small. It always does. The estate was tangled after Samuel died. Notes and a mortgage and papers Ada didn't fully understand, and a town clerk named who handled the accounts. One morning in early spring, that clerk drove out to Cedar Bend in a black coupe and found Elias mending harness in the barn. He had a paper with him. He was a nervous man, this clerk, and he couldn't quite look Elias in the eye while he read it. The estate, he said, was economizing, times being what they were. It had been decided that Elias would be retired. Pensioned off was the word he used, like it was a kindness. $6 a month. A cot had been arranged for him in the room over the feed store in town, warm and dry, and here was a bus ticket, should he care to visit his people, if he had any. The farm, the clerk said, and then he stopped, and started again. The farm had no more use for his legs. That was the phrase, no more use for his legs. 44 years, and it fit on one sheet of paper. Now here's the thing you have to know about Elias. The thing that tells you everything. He didn't shout. He didn't curse the clerk or throw the paper in the dirt. He set down the harness, real slow, and he wiped his hands on his trousers, and he listened to the whole thing to the end. Then he asked for one thing, just one. Not more money, not his job back. He asked if he might keep his old surveyor's chain pin. The steel pin he'd driven the corners with back in '95. It had been in his kit 41 years, and it wasn't worth 2 bits to anybody but him. The clerk, relieved it was so cheap, said of course. Keep it. And that would have been the end of it. Except that later, over a cup of coffee the clerk poured out of decency more than kindness, Elias said a thing. He said it easy, the way you mention weather. He wasn't complaining. He was just an old man remembering out loud. Doesn't much matter where they set the wire now, Elias said, turning his cup. The true corner's not a wire anyhow. It's a stone. Me and Lindquist buried it by the cottonwood, down in the bottom, back in '95. Chiseled the year right into it, 3 feet down. He smiled a little, to himself. Folks forget a fence is just a fence. The line's where the stone is. The clerk nodded the way you nod at an old man's stories. Said something about that being a long time ago. Finished his coffee and drove back to town. And he forgot it before the coupe hit the county road. Every word of it. Thrown away, like everything else about Elias Tandy that spring. But you heard it. Hold on to it. Because that stone is going to matter more than any paper in this whole story. Elias moved his things to town. It wasn't much. A trunk, a razor, his old army coat from the war in Cuba, and the chain pin wrapped in an oilcloth. The room over the feed store smelled of grain dust and mice, and the window looked down on the loading dock, and at night he could hear the trains from 3 miles off. He never did use the bus ticket. It stayed buttoned in his shirt pocket like a thing he was saving. He'd walk out to the edge of town some evenings where the buildings gave way to the flats, and he'd look east toward Cedar Bend, and then he'd walk back and go to bed. An old man in a rented room. That's what they'd made of him, and they thought that was the end of it. Then the fence moved. It happened in a single night, which tells you it was planned careful and done fast. Coyle's half-moon spread ran up against the north edge of the Merrick bottom, and one morning Ada Merrick rode out to check her fences and found them where they had no business being. The whole Cedar Creek line had been pulled up and reset 60 acres to the south. New posts, still oozing where the auger bit them. Fresh wire, so bright it caught the sun. 60 acres of her best bottomland, the ground that watered her whole herd, now sitting inside Vernon Coyle's fence like it had always been his. She rode straight to the half-moon. I'll give her that much. Ada Merrick was a widow with a mortgage and not many friends among the men who ran the county. But she rode right up to Coyle's big house and called him out to his own gate. Vernon Coyle came out unhurried. He was 57 that year, president of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company, a heavy-set man with soft hands and a way of talking to you like you were a child who'd asked a foolish question. He listened to Ada with his thumbs in his vest, and when she was done he shook his head, slow and sorry. The line's where my survey says it is, Ada, he told her. I had it run fresh by a licensed man. Fences don't lie. He looked off toward the creek, toward all that green water-fed ground. Old men do, though, and old memories. But a survey's a survey. She said the fence had been in the same place 40 years. He said 40 years of a fence being wrong didn't make it right, and that if she doubted the survey, she was welcome to pay for one of her own. And did she have the money for that, with the note coming due? He knew she didn't. That was the whole cruelty of it, said Gentle, at his own gate, with the sun on the water behind him. Ada rode home shaking. She wasn't a woman who fought men over papers. Her whole life she'd signed where the men told her to sign and trusted that the papers were true, because that was how she'd been raised. But she went to town and she found a lawyer. Not a good one. A cheap one, the only kind she could reach. A tired man with a storefront office and a bottle in the drawer. And it was in that office, by chance, that the second thing happened. Elias was in town, of course. Word of the moved fence had gone through Cedar Bend like fire through dry grass. And Elias had walked out that very morning to see it with his own eyes. He'd stood at the new wire a long while. Then he'd gone and found Ada at the lawyer's, and he told them both, plain, what he knew. That wire's 60 acres off true, he said. I helped set the corner myself. It's south of there. Down by the cottonwood, in the bottom. There's a stone in the ground marks the real line, and it's been there since '95. He said it to the lawyer straight, so it would be heard. Whatever paper Coyle's got, the ground don't match it. You can prove that. The corner's still there. The lawyer wrote something on a pad. I want you to notice that. He wrote it down. That's the first warning, made a matter of record, a thing Elias said out loud to a man of law with a pen in his hand. But then the lawyer set the pen down and told Ada the truth of how these things go. A survey was a survey. A judge would look at a licensed man's paper and fresh figures, and against that, what did they have? An old hired man's memory of a stone nobody had seen in 40 years. He was sorry. He'd do what he could. But she should think about settling. Elias sat there while the lawyer talked past him like he wasn't in the room. He didn't say anything more. He'd said his piece and it had gone into a pad and under a bottle. But something in him took the measure of that day. He'd worked 44 years, and they'd retired him for $6. Now they'd move a fence over the truth, and when he pointed at the truth, a tired man wrote it down and told the widow to give up. Elias folded his hands in his lap and kept quiet. That was his blind spot, if he had one. He figured no one was ever going to ask him. So he almost didn't tell. The hearing came in April. Now a boundary hearing in a county like Harlow is a public thing. Half the reason folks come is the show of it. The little courtroom over the county offices was full that morning, 40 people if it was one, farmers and their wives and the idle men who followed any quarrel, all packed onto the hard benches in the gallery. Ada sat down front with her cheap lawyer. Across the aisle sat Vernon Coyle, comfortable as a man in his own parlor. And beside him his real lawyer, brought in from the city, Harlan Pike. 44 years old, sharp-suited, a man who believed with his whole heart that the paper was the land, and the land was the paper, and nothing else was real. Elias came in quiet and took a seat in the very back row, alone, his hat on his knee. Pike ran the show. He put up Coyle's new survey, run by a young surveyor named Furrow, and he walked the judge through it point by point, all the bearings and distances laid out crisp on fresh paper. It looked like the truth. That's the thing about a good survey. It looks like the truth whether it is or not. The figures were clean, the licensed man's stamp was on it. And Pike laid it before the judge like scripture. Coyle sat and nodded along, sorrowful and reasonable. A big man doing his best to be fair to a poor widow who was, sadly, mistaken. Ada's lawyer did what little he could. He said the fence had stood 40 years. Pike smiled and said a fence was not evidence, a survey was evidence. And 40 years of an unsurveyed fence proved only 40 years of somebody's carelessness. The judge, an old careful man himself, seemed inclined to agree. You could feel the room settling toward Coyle. You could feel 60 acres sliding across the aisle. And that's when Elias stood up. He hadn't been called. Nobody had asked him a thing. He was just an old man in the back row, and he got to his feet slow, the way old men do, holding the bench in front of him, and he spoke into the quiet. "Your Honor, that line's wrong." The whole room turned. You could hear the benches creak. I helped run the original survey. 1895. I was chainman to the county surveyor, Mr. Lindquist. We set that corner 60 acres south of where that man's wire is now. His voice was steady, an old plain voice, no tremble in it. "There's a monument in the ground down there. A limestone stone with the year cut in it. I cut it myself. You dig it up, you'll see where the true line runs." For a moment, nobody spoke. And then Harlan Pike did a thing that Elias would remember to the day he died. And that I want you to remember too. Pike didn't argue with him. He didn't call for the stone to be found. He turned to the judge, and he let a little smile come up on his face, and he spread his hands like a reasonable man faced with something almost too sad to answer. "Your Honor, whatever this gentleman remembers isn't a survey. It's a story." He let that sit. "A charming one, I'm sure. But the county has already seen fit to pension the old fellow off. $6 a month, I'm told, to be rid of exactly this kind of memory. I'd ask the court not to weigh 40-year-old daydreams against a licensed instrument." And the room laughed. Not a big laugh. Not a cruel roar. Worse than that, a small laugh, a soft, easy ripple of it. The sound of 40 neighbors deciding all at once that the old man was a bit touched and that the lawyer had put it nicely. A couple of the idle men grinned. One woman covered her mouth. And Vernon Coyle, he didn't laugh at all. He just looked back at Elias with a kind of pity, which was somehow the worst of it. Elias stood there in the middle of that small laugh. His face didn't change. He looked at Pike, and he looked at the judge, and then, slow, he sat back down, put his hat back on his knee, folded his hands. But something had changed. You couldn't see it from the benches, but it was there. Up until that laugh, this had been about Ada's 60 acres, about a fence and a widow and a note at the bank. Now it was about something else. 40 faces had watched them throw him away twice. Once with $6 and once with a laugh, and 40 faces were going to have to be there when the account came due. Because it was going to come due. Elias Tandy had opened a debt in that room, whether the room knew it or not, and the whole rest of this story is the paying of it in front of those same 40 faces. He didn't say another word that day. The judge took the survey under advisement, and everyone filed out. Out on the courthouse steps, a couple of men clapped Elias on the shoulder, not unkind, the way you'd humor an old fellow. Told him it was a good try. He nodded and thanked them and walked back to his room over the feed store. And Vernon Coyle, satisfied the thing was as good as won, decided to press it home. He didn't wait for the ruling. That's the kind of man he was. Inside the week, his crew went down and posted the bottom. Nailed up boards on every tree along the creek. No trespassing. Property of Meridian Land A&D cattle. And they fenced the creek crossing itself, wired it tight, so that Ada Merrick's cattle, standing on Ada Merrick's grass, couldn't walk down to Ada Merrick's water. In dry country. In the spring, with the herd wanting to drink and calves at foot. Coyle put a fence between her stock and the creek and dared her to cut it. Then he made his offer. He was a thorough man. He came at her from both sides at once, the fence and the bank. He sent word through the lawyer that he'd buy the disputed 60 acres outright. $22 an acre. Cash. A fair price, he called it. More than fair, for ground a court was about to hand him for nothing anyway. And he said it plain in the letter, the velvet over the iron. Better to take it, Ada, before the costs eat the rest of the farm. Because behind all of it, behind the fence and the survey and the offer, stood the note. $1,150 owed to the Cattlemen's Trust of Harlow, with a payment due at harvest, and everyone in the county knew the widow Merrick was one bad season from losing the whole place. $22 an acre would just about make that payment. Coyle knew it. He'd counted it out. He was buying her own desperation back to her. And Ada Merrick nearly signed. I won't pretend she didn't. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter and the settlement paper in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she came right up to the edge of it. She was tired. She'd been fighting alone a long time. The court had all but told her she was wrong, the whole town had laughed at her one witness, her cattle were bawling at a fence. And here was a way to keep her house and clear the note in one signature. It's easy, from a bench in the back, to say she should have fought. Sit at that table with a dead husband and a live mortgage and see how the pen feels in your hand. She dipped it in the ink. That's how close it came. She dipped the pen. And she couldn't do it. Not that night. She set the pen down and told herself she'd sign in the morning, which is what people say when they can't bear to do a thing but can't see the way out of it either. She left the paper on the table and went up to bed. Now here is where I have to take you across town, to the room over the feed store. Because the same night Ada Merrick was sitting over that pen, Elias Tandy could not sleep. He'd been quiet for weeks, quiet since the laugh. He'd carried it around inside him like a stone of his own, and told himself the same thing he'd always told himself, that nobody was going to ask him, that his part in it was done, that an old pensioned man had no business in the affairs of courts. But he'd heard about the crossing. Word had come to him that Coyle had fenced Ada's stock off the water, and something about that, something about cattle kept from a creek that had watered cattle for 40 years, would not let him lie still. He got up in the dark. He didn't rightly decide to. His body decided for him. He dressed, and he took the chain pin out of its oilcloth, and he lit the lantern. And he went down the outside stairs and out of town on foot east toward Cedar Bend, the way he'd looked so many evenings. 3 miles in the dark to a place he could have walked with his eyes shut. He wasn't going to do anything. He told himself that too. He just wanted to stand on the ground. The moon was up over the bottom when he got there. The new fence ran silver across the low ground, Coyle's bright wire, and beyond it the creek talked to itself the way it always had, not caring whose fence stood where. Elias climbed through the wire, careful of his coat, and he walked out onto the ground that had been Merrick ground since before Coyle was weaned. And then he did the thing he'd been a chainman for. The thing 41 years hadn't taken out of his legs. He found the old cottonwood. It stood where it had always stood, bigger now, a great gray tower of it against the stars. And if you knew where to look, and he did, you could still see the old blaze on its trunk, healed over and grown around, but there, the hatchet mark Lindquist had cut to make it a witness tree. Elias put his hand flat on the bark. Then he turned his back to it, and he began to pace. He knew the count. He'd known it 40 years. So many paces on such a bearing off the witness tree to the corner. His stride wasn't a young man's stride anymore, so he corrected for it the way a good chainman learns to, and he counted under his breath, and the lantern threw his long shadow out across the moved wire and the stolen ground. He walked it off slow. And where the count ran out, he stopped. He knelt down in the grass. He set the lantern beside him. And he pressed his old hand into the cold spring dirt, right on the spot, and he could feel it. Not the stone, not yet. It was 3 feet down. But the ground, the rise and set of it, the way the bottom lay, the very tilt of the earth in that place. And it was true. It was exactly, unarguably true. The corner was right there under his hand, 60 acres south of Coyle's bright wire, exactly where 2 honest men had buried it in 1895. The fence had lied. The survey had lied. The whole town had laughed at the one man who wasn't lying. Elias knelt in the dark over the true corner, and for the first time since the morning they gave him $6 and told him the farm had no more use for his legs, the old man smiled. Then, out across the bottom, a dog began to bark. And a light came bobbing along the far fence line. Furrow's man. The watchman Coyle had set to guard his new wire, coming on at the barking, coming toward the one small lantern glowing out in the middle of the stolen ground. Elias reached down and closed his hand over the flame. The flame died between his fingers and the dark came down like a lid. He held still. The dog was closer now, low and steady, and the lantern along the far fence swung and bobbed with a man's walk. Elias did not run. A man who runs in the dark falls, and a man who falls gets found. He went down on his hands and knees in the wet grass and he crawled. He crawled toward the corn. Coyle's crew had left the last year's stalks standing along the field edge, dry and rattling, and Elias went into them the way a boy goes into tall grass, low and quiet, and he lay down flat on the cold ground between the rows. The lantern came out into the bottom. It stopped near the cottonwood, right about where his own light had been. The man lifted it and turned it in a slow circle. The dog cast around, nose down, whining, "Somebody out here?" The watchman called. His voice cracked on the empty air. "I see you. I'll set this dog on you." He did not see anything. There was nothing to see but grass and a moved wire and 60 acres of stolen dark. Elias lay in the corn and breathed slow through his mouth and waited. After a while the man swore at the dog and turned back toward the far fence, and the light went with him, smaller and smaller, until it was just a firefly against the hill. Elias got up. His knees were soaked and his hands were shaking, and not from the cold. He was 68 years old, and he had just crawled through a cornfield in the dark like a poacher, on ground he had walked upright for 44 years. He stood there a minute and let that sit on him. Then he found the road by the feel of it under his boots, and he walked the 3 miles back to town. He did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the cot in the little room over the feed store with his wet trousers hung on the chair, and he watched the window go from black to gray to the first hard white of morning. And somewhere in that long sitting, the fear went out of him, and something else came in and took its place. He was done crawling. When the courthouse opened, Elias Tandy was on the step waiting. He had put on his other shirt, the clean one, and he had shaved. In his shirt pocket, folded soft with handling, was the bus ticket he had never used. He went in past the tall doors and down the cold hall to the county clerk's window, and he set his hands flat on the counter so they would not shake. "I want to swear something out," he said. "A statement. Under oath, in writing, entered on the record." The clerk was a young man with ink on his fingers. He blinked. "A statement regarding what, sir?" "The section corner between the Merrick place and the Half Moon. I helped set it. 1895. I was the chainman for the county survey, and I know where the true corner lies, and I want it written down and sworn to before there's a ruling." The clerk looked at him a long moment. He was young enough to have laughed at the hearing with the rest of them. But something in the old man's face stopped it. He got the form. He dipped the pen. And Elias Tandy, who they had pensioned off with $6 and told the farm had no more use for his legs, stood at the counter and made himself a fact of the record. He gave the bearings the way he remembered them. He named the witness tree, the blazed cottonwood. He described the stone, limestone, a good 2-man stone, chiseled with the year and Lindquist's mark, set 3 feet in the ground. He signed his name. The clerk stamped it and read it back and put it in the file with the case, and it was done. Whatever came now, they would have to speak to what was written, and what was written was true. Word travels in a small town faster than a man can walk. By noon they knew at the Half Moon that the old hired hand had sworn out a paper. Harlan Pike read it in his office, and laughed once, short, and slid it aside. Vernon Coyle read it, and did not laugh. But he did not worry either. A paper from a senile old man was still just a story with a stamp on it. Let him swear to a buried stone. There was no buried stone. Coyle had bought the ground and paid a licensed man to run the line, and licensed men did not answer to memory. He told Pike to move the trial up. Get it done, get Ada Merrick's name on the deed. Before the whole county got to feeling sorry for a chainman who couldn't let go. There was one more thing Elias needed, and he went to get it that evening. Old Lindquist had a daughter. Cora, they called her, and she had never married. and she lived in her father's house at the edge of town with his books and his instruments and his ways. Elias had not spoken to her in years, but he remembered the county surveyor bent over his field notebook on the section line in 1895, licking the pencil and writing down every bearing and every set corner in his small square hand, and Elias remembered that Lindquist never threw a notebook away in his life. Cora Lindquist opened the door with a lamp in her hand. She was 63 now, gray, straight-backed, with her father's sharp eyes. She looked at the old man on her porch a long moment. "You're Tandy," she said. "You held the chain for my father." "I did, ma'am. In '95. On the Cedar Bend line." He turned his hat in his hands. "They're going to give the Merrick bottom to Coyle tomorrow on a false survey." I swore out what I know. But my word is just an old man's word to them. Your father wrote it down that summer. The bearings, the corner. If those books are still there still, Cora said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold." Her father's field notebooks filled a whole shelf, ranged in order by the year, bound in canvas gone brown at the edges. She ran her finger along them and pulled the one marked 1895 and set it on the table under the lamp and turned the stiff pages. Township lines. Fence rows. Little penciled maps in a dead man's hand. And there, near the middle, the Cedar Bend section. She turned the book so Elias could see, and she put her finger on the page. There it was. The bearing off the witness tree, the distance in chains and links, the note in Lindquist's small square letters. Set limestone monument, chiseled 1895, 3F'd. Blazed cottonwood N. As witness. The very numbers Elias had carried in his head for 41 years, written down the same summer by the man who set the corner with him. His memory and the paper agreed to the link. Cora looked at the old man's face over the lamp. "He always said the young chainman had the best eye he ever worked with," she said quietly. "He said you could pace a line drunk and hit the pin. I didn't know you were still living." "Barely," Elias said, and something between them almost smiled. She told him then, because she was a surveyor's daughter and she could not help it. The thing that mattered most, and she said it plain. "You understand what this is, Mr. Tandy. This isn't just my father's word against theirs. In the law, a boundary is not where the newest fence stands. It's where the original monument was set. That's the rule. A wire can be moved in a night. A corner controls. If you can put the court's hand on the stone my father set, their survey is nothing. It's a drawing of a lie." "That's why I came," Elias said. "I know where the stone is. I need somebody who can prove I'm not making it up." Cora Lindquist closed the notebook and held it against her chest a moment, the way you hold a thing that belonged to a father. Then she put it in his hands. "Take it to court," she said. "I'll come and swear to whose hand wrote it. My father set that corner honest." He'd not rest easy knowing it was lost. Elias walked home under the stars with the notebook buttoned inside his coat over his heart, and for the first time in weeks he was not afraid of the morning. He stopped by Ada Merrick's dark house on the way, and he did not knock, because it was late, and because he had nothing yet he could show her. He just stood at the gate a moment and looked at the light in her kitchen window, low and yellow, where she would be sitting up with the mortgage papers and the settlement pen and the whole weight of Cedar Bend on her 51-year-old shoulders. He wanted to tell her to hold on, to not sign, to give him one more day. He did not. He went home and slept 4 hours like a stone. The trial was in the district courtroom, and the same 40 faces came. It was planting season and men had work, but a fight over 60 acres of creek bottom was better than any work, and the gallery filled up early. Ada sat at the front table with her cheap town lawyer, a decent enough young man out of his depth, and her hands folded on the settlement paper Coyle's people had drawn. Unsigned but ready, a pen laid across it like a promise. Across the aisle sat Vernon Coyle in a good gray suit, and beside him Harlan Pike with his leather case, and behind them the young surveyor, Furrow, 29 years old, uneasy in a starched collar, holding a rolled map like a man holding a thing he half wished he hadn't drawn. Pike ran it just as he had at the hearing, only smoother now. Official, he unrolled Furrow's survey on the easel, clean lines, a licensed man's seal, bearings and distances in India ink. He put Furrow on the stand and walked him through it, and Furrow answered low and correct, and it all looked like the settled truth. The paper was the land. Pike made sure the judge heard it 3 times. A licensed survey, filed, sealed, current, against it. What? An old man's story. The judge was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one, and careful men rule on the record. He looked at the clean survey and the sealed filing, and he looked at the widow's unsigned settlement, and you could see him coming to it. He said half to the room that absent some evidence to controvert a licensed survey, the court would have little choice but to establish the line as filed. Ada's hand moved toward the pen. Your Honor. Elias Tandy stood up in the gallery. I swore a statement into this court. I'd asked to speak to it. Pike was up before the old man finished. Your Honor, we've been over this. The county pension is the county's judgment on this witness's competence. $6 a month to be rid of the memory. I move his statement be struck. A story is not evidence. The judge looked at Elias a long moment across the whole quiet room. 40 faces turned. It was the same room, the same eyes that had laughed before. Elias stood there in his clean shirt with the notebook in his coat, and he did not look away. He swore it under oath, and it's in my file, the judge said. I'll hear him. Sit down, Mr. Pike. Come forward, sir, and be sworn. Elias walked up the aisle. He had walked a great many lines in his life, but that was the longest, past all those faces, up to the little box, and he put his hand on the book and swore to tell the truth, and he sat where they could all see him. Pike leaned back with his arms folded and a small smile ready. Coyle looked bored, or made himself look it. Furrow watched the old man's hands. Say your piece, the judge said. Elias did not shout. He had thought about that all the long night, and he had decided a shout was what they expected from a beaten man, and he would not give it to them. He spoke dry and even, the way you'd tell a boy where the well was. In 1895 I held the chain for the county surveyor, Mr. Lindquist, when this section was run. I was a young man. We set the corner between what's now the Merrick place and the Half Moon down in the Cedar Creek bottom. We set a limestone stone, a 2-man stone, and Mr. Lindquist chiseled the year in it and cut his mark. And we sunk it 3 feet in the ground the way a corner's set to last. And he blazed a cottonwood standing north of it for a witness tree, so a man could always find the corner again if the stone worked down. That tree is still standing. The blaze is grown over, but it's there. You can put your hand on it. The room had gone quiet in a different way than the laughing quiet. Mr. Coyle's survey, Elias said, runs his line 60 acres south of that stone, right through the middle of the widow's bottom. And I know it's 60 acres wrong because 2 weeks ago I walked down there in the dark and I pasted off the witness tree the way I was taught, and the ground under his new wire is not the corner. The corner's south of it. 3 feet down. Under grass he's calling his. Pike shifted. Your Honor, this is exactly the, let him finish, the judge said. Elias reached into his coat then, slow, and he took out the canvas notebook and held it up so the whole room could see it. This is Mr. Lindquist's field book from that summer. His daughter kept it. His own hand, that same year, wrote down the bearing and the distance to that stone, and wrote down the blazed cottonwood as the witness. It matches what I swore. It matches to the link. He set the book on the rail. I'm not asking you to take my word, Judge. I'm an old man, they retired, and I know how much my word weighs in this town. I'm asking you to go dig. The stone's either there or it isn't. If it isn't, I'm a fool and Mr. Coyle can have his line. If it is, he looked out across the room, past Pike's stiff smile, straight at Vernon Coyle. And he said the thing quiet. "You can move a wire in one night, sir. You can hire a man to draw you a new one on clean paper. But you cannot move a stone two honest men set in the ground before you were born. It's been lying down there the whole time you were telling this town I was senile. Go dig it up." Nobody laughed. You could hear the clock on the wall. Cora Lindquist rose from the back where nobody had noticed her come in. "Your Honor, I'm Lindquist's daughter. That's my father's field book, and that's his hand. I'll swear to it. And I'll tell you what my father would tell you if he were living. A corner controls a fence, not the other way around. If that monument is in the ground, then the newest survey in this room is a drawing of a stolen 60 acres, and no seal on it makes it true." The judge sat still a moment. Then he took off his glasses and looked at Harlan Pike, who had stopped smiling. "Mr. Pike," he said, "your survey rests on the location of the true corner. This man swears the corner is monumented and buried and gives me a bearing, a distance, a witness tree, and a contemporaneous field note in the original surveyor's hand. That is evidence to controvert. I'm not going to rule a man off his land on a paper when there's a stone I can put my hand on. This court will adjourn to the creek bottom. Mr. Furrow, bring your chain and a spade. We'll settle it in the ground." Coyle came half out of his chair. "Judge, this is a circus. You're going to march the county into a cow pasture on the say-so of a monument if it's there," the judge said. "If it's not there, Mr. Coyle, you'll have your line and this man his humiliation, and you can go home. Sit down. We're all going to the creek." They went. It was the strangest procession Cedar Bend ever saw. The judge in his coat, the two lawyers, the widow, the young surveyor with his tripod and his chain and a spade over his shoulder, and behind them the whole gallery, 40 neighbors strung out along the section road in the spring sun, walking 3 miles to a cow pasture to watch an old man be right or be finished. Elias walked at the front with Cora Lindquist. He did not look back at the crowd. He looked at the cottonwood coming up green in the bottom, the same tree, standing where it had stood in 1895 when he was a young man with a strong back and the best eye the county surveyor ever worked with. At the tree he stopped. He put his hand flat on the bark, and this time he found the blaze for them, the old healed hatchet scar, and Furrow leaned in and looked, and you could see the young surveyor's face change. Cora read the bearing from her father's book. Furrow set his tripod and shot the line and paced the chain off the witness tree. Careful, official, everyone watching. And where his chain ran out he drove a pin and looked up. It was 60 acres south of Coyle's wire. Almost exactly. "Dig there," the judge said. Furrow took off his good coat and rolled his sleeves, and he dug. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the spade in the wet spring dirt and the creek running loud in the bottom and the wind in the new cottonwood leaves. A foot down. 2 feet. Furrow was sweating, and the hole was dark, and the crowd had gone in close. A ring of 40 faces looking down into the ground, where an old man swore the truth was buried. The spade rang on stone. It was a small sound, iron on limestone. But 40 people heard it, and 40 people went still. Furrow stopped. He got down on his knees in the mud, and he dug with his hands, throwing the dirt back. And the stone came clear, a good gray 2-man limestone stone, set square and deep the way corners were set to last 100 years. Furrow brushed the face of it with his palm. And there, cut in the old rock, worn but plain as the day Lindquist chiseled it, was the year. 895, and under it the old surveyor's mark. Nobody said a word. The creek ran, and the wind moved in the tree. Furrow knelt in the hole with his hand on the stone and looked up, and the first thing he did, the young man who had run the false survey for pay, was tell the truth. "It's the corner, Your Honor," he said, his voice not steady. "It's a set monument. It's chiseled 95. It's exactly where he said." He looked at the wire shining 60 acres to the north, his own stakes, his own clean lines. My survey's wrong. I ran what I was staked to run. The line's here. It's always been here. Then the murmur came, low, rolling through the 40 neighbors like wind through the corn, and Elias Tandy stood by the witness tree with his hat in his hands and watched the town that had laughed at him look down into a hole at the truth he'd carried alone for 41 years. He did not smile this time. He was too full for it. They went back to the courtroom to make it law, because a thing has to be written to be finished. The judge sat and the room filled, and he did not take long. He set the true boundary at the recovered monument by the bearing in the field book, confirmed by the stone in the ground. He voided Del Ferro's survey as run from a false corner. He restored the 60 acres of Cedar Creek bottom to Ada Merrick, free of Coyle's claim and Coyle's wire. And he ordered Vernon Coyle to pay the costs of the action, the surveying, and the dig. Ada Merrick sat at her table with the settlement paper still in front of her, unsigned, and when the judge said her land was hers, she put her hand over her mouth and her shoulders shook once. And the young lawyer beside her let out a breath he'd been holding for an hour. Now came the faces. Vernon Coyle did not rage. That was the thing that stayed with the neighbors after. 57 years old, president of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company, and when the ruling came, he just went a slow gray in the face, like a man watching water go down where he'd meant to build. He gathered his hat off the table. He did not look at Elias, and he did not look at Ada. He said one thing, low, to no one at all, to the table maybe, or to the wire 60 acres north that was worth nothing now. It was just wire, he said. And he stood up and walked out. On the courthouse steps a man in a town suit was waiting for him. A man from the Cattlemen's Trust of Harlow. With a soft voice and a folder under his arm, and he took Coyle gently by the elbow and said something about the half-moon's own notes coming due, and the two of them went down the steps together into the spring afternoon. Coyle had leveraged himself thin buying up the county 60 acres at a time, and the whole town knew it now. And the trust knew it. And a man who has just lost a public fight is a man his creditors come to see. Nobody in the courtroom gloated. They just watched him go, small on the steps, and understood they were watching the beginning of the end of him. Harlan Pike did not go out with his client. Pike stayed behind at the clerk's window, and he waited until the room had mostly cleared, and then he asked the clerk, quiet, if he might amend a thing in his own filing. The clerk got the paper. Pike took the pen, and he struck out a line he had written and been so proud of, the line about a story and not a survey, drew it through until you couldn't read it. He capped the pen. He gathered his case. And when he turned to go, he passed close by Elias Tandy in the aisle, and the old man looked at him, and Harlan Pike, 44 years old, who argued that the paper was the land, could not raise his eyes off the floor. He went out without a word. Del Ferro came to Elias. His good coat was still muddy from the hole, and his hands were dirty, and he did not try to clean them. He put out his hand, and Elias took it. "I never checked the old corner," Ferro said. "A licensed man's supposed to search for the original monument before he sets a new line. I didn't. Coyle staked me the line he wanted run, and I ran it, and I told myself that was the job." He looked at the old man. "It wasn't the job. You knew the job better than me, and I've got the license." He shook his head. "I'm going to rerun the whole section. True, off that stone. On my own time. It's the least of what I owe this." He did it too. That summer, unpaid, and set new iron pins the honest way, off the monument two men buried in 1895. Then the room was near empty, and Ada Merrick came across it to where Elias stood. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman who made speeches, and there was nothing a speech could have carried anyhow. She took the old man's hand in both of hers in front of the few who were left, and she looked up at his plain, tired face, and she said his name. Elias. That was all. For a second. Just his name, said like it weighed something. "Come home," she said. "Off that cot over the feed store. Come home, And don't you ever ask me for a bus ticket again." And Cora Lindquist, gathering her father's notebook off the rail, brought Elias the other thing. Her father's old surveyor's chain. The very chain the young man had held on the line in 1895. Coiled and kept all these years in the surveyor's house. She put it in his hands. "He'd want you to have it," she said. "You held the end of it once. Keep it by your pin." Elias Tandy stood in the emptying courtroom with a widow's hand in his and a dead surveyor's chain in his arms. And he was not the man they had pensioned off with $6 anymore. He never had been. He was just the only one who'd known it. It was summer again before you'd have called things settled. Summer of 1937, and Cedar Bend green to the horizon, and the Cedar Creek bottom loud with water where it had always run. Elias Tandy sat on the Merrick porch in the long gold light of a Kansas evening, in a chair that was his now, and watched the day go down. The cattle were in the bottom. They watered at the creek where cattle had watered on that land for 60 years, in the 60 acres that were the widow's again, free and clear, the mortgage paid down from a good year's grass and a good year's corn off ground that fed the whole place. On the kitchen sill behind him sat the first ripe tomato of the season, red as anything. The way he'd saved the first one for Ada every year for longer than either of them cared to count. She was inside, and he could hear her at the stove, and it was the kind of sound a man could grow old listening to. Down in the bottom, if you walked to it, you'd find the stone. They'd set it proper now, at the true corner. The old limestone monument up out of its hole and squared, and a fresh iron pin driven beside it. Furrow's honest pin, so no one would ever have to dig for the truth again. The neighbors' children played in the creek down there in the hot afternoons, and now and again one of them would ask about the gray stone with the old year cut in it, and they were told. They were told 2 men buried it with their own hands in 1895. And that one of those men was the old fellow up on the Merrick porch, and that a whole county once decided his memory was worth nothing, and that his memory turned out to be worth 60 acres and a widow's farm. Vernon Coyle was gone. The Half Moon had been sold off in pieces to pay the trust, a quarter section here and there, and the Meridian Land and Cattle Company was a name on old paper now. Harlan Pike had moved his practice 2 counties over, where the story didn't follow him around the square. Nobody in Cedar Bend spoke of either of them much. There wasn't any need. Cora Lindquist came out to the farm sometimes with her father's books, and she and Elias would sit on the porch and read the old bearings out loud to each other like other people read scripture, and it made them both easy. A young fellow from the county came out that summer, some clerk sent to note the new corner for the plat. And he found the old man on the porch and got to talking, respectful. The way the young had learned to be with Elias Tandy now, and at the end of it he asked, meaning it kindly, whether it was true that Mr. Tandy had been the hired man on this place going on 45 years. Elias watched the cattle move down in the honest bottom, and the water run, and the last light go copper on the true fence line that stood now exactly where 2 honest men had put it. "I'm the one who knew where the line ran," he said. And that was all he ever said about it. Wherever you're watching from tonight, comment your town. I'd like to know how far this old fence line travels.